Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Tipping Point, where we ask key questions about how we balance conservation and development. Tipping Point is an initiative of Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, and we host these monthly webinars every Thursday at 1 p.m. I am Rendani Nenguda, Senior Research Associate at Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, and your facilitator for today. Now, the focus for today's webinar is on research funding, which is quite a topical subject in the last 4 months, considering how key conservation projects are suddenly endangered by the large-scale funding cuts by Europe and US. In light of this shift in funding flows, conservationists are now having to regroup and set their plans in place. And now, I'm glad that you have all joined us for this webinar. Please be aware that the webinar is recorded and will be available on all Oppenheimer Generations channels, including our YouTube channel. I encourage you to sign up for the OGRC quarterly newsletter and stay tuned on our OGRC social media channels so you don't miss out on any upcoming news and announcements. We're excited to have such a good turnout today. Just for a few housekeeping rules, if you have any questions along the way, please do not hesitate to use the chat box. Please also feel free, if you've just joined the webinar, to use the chat box to introduce yourselves for the time being. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of experts who are in the field of research and conservation and who have directly or indirectly been impacted or affected by the recent funding cuts. Firstly, we have Shameela Soobramoney, CEO of the NBI, National Business Initiative, leading efforts in social and environmental sustainability. Formerly the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, she spearheaded its Sustainability and Climate Change Disclosure Guidance Initiative. She has also chaired global and national sustainability groups, including the World Federation of Exchanges, Sustainability Working Group, and the National Treasury Sustainability Finance Working Group. We also have the lovely Dani Govender. She heads up the sustainability portfolio at South African National Parks. As a conservationist with over 20 years and experience as a veterinarian scientist and science manager in the Kruger National Park, she has experienced firsthand the positive impact of biodiversity and intact habitats provide to society. She is also encouraged by the goals set out by the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework and the reimagining of financial systems to support a nature-positive economy, but more importantly, how that translates to real changes on the ground. Finally, we have Kishaylin Chetty, also known as Kish. He is the Executive Head of Sustainability at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, with over 15 years of expertise in environmental and social governance. He also advises South Africa and the SADC region on biodiversity policy and represents the country globally through IPBES and the IUCN. He champions nature-based solutions and innovative conservation finance and also forges high-impact partnerships across Africa. I'm quite honored to have such a group of esteemed panelists, and we'll just jump right into it. Considering recent events around conservation funding, I think Shameela will be the first person to give us her insights and her views on the recent events and how we can forge a way forward as the African continent and as South Africa. Shameela, over to you.
Thank you, Rendani, and hi to everybody joining us on the line. It's such a pleasure to be here in a very timely conversation, given the situation I think that we find ourselves in on multiple levels globally. So Rendani, looking at the question that we're considering today and what can we do given the situation, I think is moving into more the solutions mode. It's very important to understand, firstly, yes, there is a big scaling back. We have seen that happen, and it's affected various organizations. The organization I belong to is a business association and is set up as an NGO, and we also do a lot of project work. So it's the project work in particular that would have been impacted. and work that is broadly in the sustainability field. And so while conservation is certainly one component, I think it's the broader field of sustainability that's also impacted in different ways. And we've seen that coming through from narratives around DEI, for example, and a number of different areas. So the question I think that it really asks of us to ask ourselves is to say, what is it that we really prioritize and prize? And therefore, how should we be looking at other sources of funding, firstly, and other sources and ways in which we can mobilize the action that is needed to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve? And so that broader scaling and framing, I think, is critically important. And whilst the funding challenges that we're facing now are absolutely real, and we know have had some serious consequences for a number of organizations across the world that have been performing critical services, what we can then look at is to say, well, maybe it's the time for recalibration of what it is we prioritize and how do we think about that. If we look locally to different pools of funding that have been in some way or form affecting the different aspects of sustainability broadly, we see that some of that has been coming from corporates. We look at the pools within corporates, particularly in their CSI financing, but also in the more core elements of their work, which are looking within supply chains, for example, which are looking sustainability in different ways. And so actually form a core part of what organizations look at. Linked to that, of course, has to be, again, I think, the entrenching of the understanding of the importance of nature and the critical aspect and the critical biomes, for example, on which we depend for economic livelihoods to actually continue. And so the reiteration of that and making those linkages clear and actually understanding that it's an all of society approach that we need to look at, and hence not just dependence on donor funding, is going to be something I think that the opportunity now is for us to entrench further. And so that conversation as a community of people who work in the space broadly in sustainability and certainly in conservation, but then also to look at that from an all of society approach that says, where are the pools of the actions that we're taking that are funded in different ways, that are driving similar outcomes, and also where those spaces that we need that, for example, are not directly related, for example, where the business case that we often look at in business doesn't maybe off the cuff exist, but there's a longer term perspective that we need certain pools of funding to match, which are more aligned with those objectives. And so for me is looking at that across the board. Of course, government has a role to play. What should it be doing in that space? What should then private donors be doing? And then, of course, how do we look at businesses coming in there? Civil society as well. I mean, you know that a number of organizations, for example, have programs where they're trying to raise funding directly from people. We've all encountered people, for example, in shopping malls who are looking, for you to put a donation forward or things like that. But all of those avenues need to be there. The conversation that we need to have collectively absolutely is a prioritization one within our country context, and of course for conservation as a whole, as to what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve. And therefore, what should we be spending the money on? The clear understanding also of the multipliers of that spending and the cost of not spending it and not protecting those biomes. And so if those cases and a consistent messaging around that is achieved, we can then, we're able to better put that money together in a different way. And I think really appeal to the minds and the pockets of a larger variety than of people, of donors, and of entities than perhaps we've been drawing on up to now in the conservation space. And just I think finally, in the perspective of business as well, businesses I think are increasingly understanding that there is this massive interdependence on nature, and hence on actually having a vested interest in the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve in relation to conservation in particular. That has come through in a number of forms. Firstly, of course, you're just seeing the destruction of economic activity as a consequence of natural environments being destructed. And that's just one way that we see that conduit come through. The second one, I think, is the understanding that matters like climate change, for example, are directly dependent, or the mitigation of climate change is also dependent on the preservation of those carbon sinks, which is one element within conservation that we look at. And so those linkages are becoming more clear. We're starting to see things like central banks considering systemic risk. And so there is a very, very good channel via business to understand those risks, and hence hopefully the reverse engineering to what that means in the preservation and the conservation efforts that are critical if we want to mitigate the realization of those risks in the longer term. And so, Rendani, let me pause there, but that's where I really see that there are different conversations that need to be had, prioritizations that really are meaningful, and that we can see the linkages directly, and hence hopefully get a wider all society perspective into that conversation and hence the funding.
Thank you so much, Shameela. I like the point you make around entrenching the understanding of the importance of nature and appealing to the pockets of the people who actually have the money and the funding. I think often we don't realize that you won't protect what you do not value. And unless we entrench that understanding, no change will actually happen in terms of what people are willing to support. Just moving on to Danny. Danny, you come from a public sector perspective. What are your views on this topic?
Well, thank you, Rendani, for that, and welcome to all your listeners. I see a lot of familiar faces or familiar names, and so it's good to have you with. So just to sort of kick it off, I think that, understanding that as South Africa, we're quite well endowed in terms of our conservation spaces and seascapes and landscapes. We've got a diversity of biomes. We've got a long history of conservation success. And we've had people thinking about this. We've got a very robust model of sustainable use, of ecotourism. We've got very good infrastructure in place to really sort of benefit from a lot of this, the good, great places that we have access to. And I think most importantly, from Sandpark's perspective or from an ecotourism sort of perspective, we have a local public that really values their protected areas and their conservation spaces. And so, if you just look at the sort of the numbers in terms of Sandpark's visitation, about 70% of our tourists are actually local South Africans. It isn't the case for a lot of other protected area management authority protected areas networks in the world. And so those are all things that work in our favor. And as a result, I think we've been somewhat protected in terms of the impact of the aid funding halting and loss of some of the funding in some cases has had. And I think, we had a little bit of a black swan event in that COVID-19 and the responses to the pandemic already started to mobilize us in terms of thinking about sustainable financing for conservation. And so a lot of good work was done then. And, we already in 2021, we did the National Capital Accounting Project, which already started to try to sort of make sense about the value from biodiversity. So we know that, Jane Tuppy did some work early on showing that about 275 billion rand in biodiversity benefit flows. And that was a conservative estimate, happens every year. And so when we start to sort of, because sometimes you need to become aware of things, you've got to recognize the value that biodiversity brings. And then you start to then factor it into your planning, your policies, and your decision making. And so these sort of values, though, as conservationists, it makes us feel uncomfortable, this idea of commodifying nature. But the reality is that you need to start to elevate the fact that this is value that's being created by the natural world for humans. So, and absolutely, there's spiritual and cultural significance of biodiversity as well, and that's really important. And so, in these these estimations of the benefits that humans derive, we don't even put a value to some of those things, all the medicines, etc., that we derive from biodiversity. So in terms of conservation aid funding, we have several challenges in the country. It's unfortunately not just the fact that we're dependent on donor funding. So that is a big component of our challenge with conservation finance. But part of the reason is that we're an emerging economy. We have, rightly so, we've got competing governmental priorities. There's everything from education, there's social development, there's health. And so the funding for conservation isn't as great as we'd all like it to be. Some earlier biofin work has shown that roughly, it would take us about 15 billion rands per annum for biodiversity conservation, and we're roughly spending about 4.5 billion, and that's with provincial conservation areas and our national parks. So, but there's something interesting in this as well. Between 2015 and 2020, we've had about a 171% increase in protected environments. And I think that therein lies a really sort of telling tale, is that we can achieve a lot of our conservation goals by not only thinking about formal protected areas, but thinking about conservation agreements with other land use. So that's part of the challenge, is this idea of really an underfunding issue. Dependence on donor funding is really, the challenge really comes in there, in that it's often short-term project-based funding, and it does actually shift based on international priorities and donor priorities. And so we see now with this reprioritization of international funding, it's starting to have an impact. And so, over-dependence on it does present risks. But of course, in South Africa, if we look at just as sand parks, I think we're quite lucky in that, very small percentage of our funding, about 1 to 2% of our funding per annum, actually comes from donor funding. But saying that, it doesn't mean that their donor funding is not appreciated or not incredibly important. It often goes to support initiatives for which, because we're living in a very complex world, things like rhino poaching and snaring and poisoning, these are emerging challenges. And often budgets are not such that you can quickly redeploy into these areas of need. And really, that has become the ambit of development finance or conservation finance, aid finance. And so these funding sometimes goes to us directly, but it also goes to our NGO partner network. And so they do some really important work, especially in our buffer zones, in our larger conservation footprint, that we need work to take place. When we're starting to think about these conservation agreements and these protected environments, it's often through the good work of the NGO network that actually enables it. And that really is dependent on this aid funding. So that's been the big impact in the country. If I sort of take it back home to specifically in Kruger, where I'm based, this halting of international funding has, especially US funding, has had an impact in terms of, direct impact on anti-poaching, ranger conservation work in the park to the value of about 12 million rand. And that's everything from cameras to integrity management, to ranger wellness systems, to rhino monitors. And then more importantly, it's made our eastern boundary buffer security zone, which is around in Mozambique, a lot of that funding has been withdrawn or on halt. We've heard recently that there is actually now some release of that funding. But that, of course, as soon as that funding went away and those protectors of nature were taken away, they already started an increase in various types of wildlife crime, including poaching, but really snaring and poisoning, and just having detrimental impact in this landscape. And so this is not really just in Mozambique, but of course it's sort of in the greater Kruger landscape area. So this is having an impact as we sort of see it right now and we feel it. And so it's meant that we've got to now start to think about what are we going to do about financing the conservation needs? Because not only are we saying, we've got to protect our current protected area network, but we also are saying that we've got all these critical biodiversity areas, these key water source areas, these high risk biodiversity areas that we need to also take into account. We need to expand, we need to to expand our conservation footprint, but we also need to achieve 30 by 30. And how are we going to do that in a world of constrained finance? And so is it really constrained? And I think this is one of the things that we're starting sort of to think about. And I think all institutions are having to really think deeply as conservationists, an uncomfortable zone of having to think about financial sustainability and the finance of conservation. But we've had to sort of really, as government, non-government, and NGOs, really start to think about how do we build a robust and resilient financial system for conservation going forward. For us in sandparks, we rely a lot on ecotourism. About 70 to 80% of our funding comes from ecotourism. And so we've really had to think about, okay, we need to really think about how do we enhance that revenue generation and how do we improve our efficiency in terms of how we spend that money. And so these are sort of key initiatives that we will be driving in the next 10-year financial sustainability plan for the organization. Another sort of key element is how do we diversify and mobilize funding in terms of resource mobilization and bringing on board new sources of funding. That's Shameela's alluded to some of that. And really it's about having the system, the enabling system and governance process to allow that funding to flow. There's a lot of finance out there, but finding the means by which connecting it is actually the key challenge. So that's the part about resource mobilization. There's the other issue around accessing alternative finance, and this is really the ambit of the sustainable finance mechanisms. And really here we can think about individual mechanisms, which I think in South Africa we're doing well in terms of carbon finance, biodiversity offsets. We're trialing and incubating various projects, but it's now thinking about how do we package them into a large sort of package of sustainable financing solutions towards a greater good. And then, of course, investing for impact. How do we create things like endowment funds, and how do we also sort of align incentives so that we start to create these incentives for pro-conservation behavior? I think lastly, I just want to end with, I think there's 5 simple steps. I think we're great with signing up to global agreements, but it really comes down to, and so I think the setting the ambitious and specific goals, we kind of have that in terms of the CBD's GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework. It sets out, we want to achieve 30 by 30. We want to make sure that 30% of degraded land is actually then restored and wilded. We want to actually, so it sets out the goals for us. But now what we got to do is we got to tie it down, just ground it, operationalize it into a conservation plan with activities. So what does that mean? Because I think as a conservation community, both public and private and parastatals and NGOs, we need to have a common set of activities or goals that we're all achieving. This plan, whether that's the NBSAP, it should be the NBSAP, it should be ours, and that should be then the plan or the roadmap for how we then leverage sustainable finance. So now we know every NGO is playing a role, every parastatal and government entity is playing a role towards the common sort of vision that we see. You need to build this robust financial model, and then you've got to agree on a set of closing conditions, or you've got to agree on what success looks like. And then develop your KPIs, how you're going to measure that success together. And that needs to be developed at the onset in order for us to really unlock this finance that is there, but needs to sort of, that piping needs to be built in order for it to start to have that conservation impact on the ground. So I'll leave it there, Rendani, but thank you. I think this is a really important topic. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Danny. Danny, you raised a point around agreeing on what success looks like. And what I'm picking up from you is that there's a huge need for collaboration, but collaboration across public, private sector, and those that even lie in between, because often we're pulling in different directions, burning the sticks from both ends, trying to achieve the same thing, but because everybody wants their name on something, we don't get it done as quickly as we can or should. Now, Kish, you come from an NGO perspective. What has your experience been in the past 4 months?
Fantastic. Thank you, Rendani. And I'm going to try and be quick in the interest of time. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think it's great that we're having a conversation around this. As the world grapples with the fallout from the recent executive order that suspended US federal funding, it included support for international aid and conservation. And many of us working in the biodiversity and conservation sector have felt the immediate impact. I think the headlines have rightly focused on health programs aligned to malaria and HIV as examples, but what has been less visible has been the impact to the conservation sector. For many African organizations, the US was a major donor, and grants from USAID and related agencies were supporting species protection, anti-poaching operations, wildlife crime enforcement, and community-based conservation. So the sudden freeze has halted or delayed critical work and critical impact. At the Endangered Wildlife Trust, for example, our vulture conservation work, our canine scent detection unit involved in wildlife crime and critical environmental law and policy advocacy work has been affected. I think this came to a total of around 16 million rand, which for a South African-based NGO is quite significant. And I think it's not just about wildlife. This is also about people. So the rangers, the scientists, the communities that rely on conservation-linked livelihoods have all been affected. Conservation is not a luxury. It's essential infrastructure for sustainable development, health, and economic viability and stability. But I think the funding crisis has also been a great catalyst. It's given us a superb opportunity to rethink the space, particularly around how our dependence on foreign aid exists, how we can define value in conservation. I think that's a critical component, and how we can start to build a resilient funding environment that can weather geopolitical shocks and crises in the future. I think the good news is that there is a pathway forward, so it's not all doom and gloom. Across the continent, organizations are rethinking funding models. We're exploring and implementing tools and mechanisms in the sustainable finance space. Danny mentioned a few of those. And we're forging new partnerships with African businesses, private investors, and regional development banks. But I do think it is also a pivotal moment for Africa to lead by mobilizing local investment, strengthening regional collaboration, and to build a conservation economy that is owned and driven from within. And this is it's a great opportunity to move in that space. I do think that innovation alone is not enough. We must pair new funding models with strong accountability. So funders need confidence that their resources will deliver real, measurable, and tangible impact, that funds will be managed transparently, that outcomes are being tracked and shared. And accountability is not just about donor compliance. It's also about being ready so that when a gap appears in our effort and action, we can respond collectively and effectively. I think the Global Biodiversity Framework goals and targets and the work done around that showed that we, as a globe, we spend around $124 billion per year on biodiversity and conservation, and we need around $900 billion plus per year to restore and protect nature. So there's a significant funding gap. And in closing, I think the US funding cuts have dealt a blow to conservation, but it has also handed us a powerful opportunity to redesign a more resilient African-led conservation funding model, a system that values nature not just for its beauty, but for its vital role in sustaining human life. I think that conservation demands bold action, innovative funding, and global collaboration to secure a sustainable future for wildlife, people, and our planet. Thank you, Rendani.
Thank you so much, Kish. Kish, you made a good point around resilience and building a resilient model. Often you think necessity is the mother of all invention, and maybe we needed a COVID scale event for us to realize, well, it's not COVID, but it's a COVID scale event for us to realize that we do need to be developing new funding models that work for the continent and that do not collapse at the click of somebody's finger in a different continent elsewhere. Kesh, you also spoke about mobilizing local investment in new funding models. In light of this, Shameela, How has the private sector been involved in conservation funding, especially during this time where we've seen a huge lapse in funding flows into the African continent?
Rendani. So, there's different ways in which, particularly the private sector corporates will be funding. I mentioned earlier on that perhaps the most common of those conduits is their CSI funding, and they do that through various entities that are either supporting NGOs in the environmental or conservation sector, and then they could also be doing that indirectly through some of the business programs that they're running that are looking at nature-based solutions, for example, and looking at the finance. So the finance sector, for example, would be supporting it indirectly by looking at some of those nature-based solutions and how do you increase the financing and that. The other ways, like I said, could be the CSI funding. And then the other increasing, and I think growing area that we're seeing is from the disclosure pressure. So, you've always got to look at what matters to business, right? And if they're being asked to disclose certain things, that often is a catalyst, hopefully, for action or the right action that actually is precipitating the outcome that you want and not reporting for reporting's sake. But what that provides then is the opportunity to say, what is the information base that we should be having as business, or that as broadly we should be getting together to provide business with, that sees those linkages into nature and these things which we need to conserve and why those are important, and hence direct both the effort and the spend to the outcome that we want. And so agree completely that the GBF and the targets are helping to provide that contextualization in a similar way to which the Paris Agreement did for us in relation to climate change. And so we can look at those as the new conduits. So we've got the traditional ways in which that sort of come together, but what are the new ways in which that needs to happen? It then does require of us to have that collective conversation is what it is we should be prioritizing. And so the issue of having a common vision and an understanding becomes critical, and then putting together what is the financing need and hence where we need to get that money from. I also feel that there's actually a huge number of asks being put on business at this point in time for various reasons, as you can imagine, including, critical social issues, and there's this tension, but, keeping in mind the fact that actually social progress is very dependent on nature as well and preserving those biomes. And for many of the things that we need to achieve, ensuring that we have those conversations together and not apart are going to be important. Bringing communities along is critical. And we're seeing, for example, through the ESG agenda, and I always say that very carefully because I'm not a fan of the ESG acronym. I always believe that that will inform your thinking, and you need to think about it more as broadly sustainability, because that is really what we're trying to achieve, is to be able to achieve that ultimately as a goal. Is to be able to think about how do we do this as a collective conversation. So when we're asking about that, where are the platforms to inform what that is and what that collective goal needs to look like, and hence the shared vision, how that then translates into what matter. And of course, I'm wearing a business hat in this regard, but that is a collaborative, collective conversation that needs to happen. And then how do we find the right conduits for financing? I think that things like the instruments and the mechanisms are almost secondary, because there are huge amounts of seriously smart people that can do financial engineering if they know what the goal and the target is that we're trying to achieve. And so that conversation needs to happen. How do we translate, for example, biodiversity goals into meaningful actions for business that are going to feed that outcome and that end? And so then the money, I think, will flow in the direction we need it to, rather than in perhaps, potentially pet projects or a foundation or thing that you maybe had some success with, and this is what we want to do. So there is that space for the conversation collectively and what we want to achieve. It's great to see that some of that is being precipitated by the global biodiversity goals. And then, like I said, the other opportunity, apart from the obvious, is to say, what is the requirement in relation to disclosure that is now coming down on business? We've had the sustainability disclosure frameworks. We know the ISSB has been there. We've had it for climate, and we know that the next one that is going to come is going to be nature-related disclosure. That provides a massive opportunity to create the foundation for the framing and hence the outputs that we want that to achieve, rather than a reporting and a disclosure for a disclosure's sake. So I see those as being huge opportunities to actually direct the conversation and get ahead of what we're going to be looking at and hence spending our money on.
Thank you, Shameela. Just going back to Shameela's point on speaking to business and the flow of money in the right direction. Kish, there's a common perception shared by business and philanthropic organizations that NGOs can be quite wasteful with limited transparency around how funds are spent. More so in the current funding climate where resources are increasingly constrained. NGOs are often viewed as a risky investment. You don't really know where the money is going. I think somebody made a similar comment in the chat box. So my question is, given this concern by business, by philanthropic organizations, how can NGOs strengthen accountability and build trust with funders and stakeholders to mitigate this perception of risk in supporting NGO work?
I think that's a vital question, especially in today's constrained funding environment where every rand or dollar is actively scrutinized. I think it was Mark Butter who posted in the chat, and he's absolutely correct. Now, the perception that NGOs are high risk or lack transparency is not unfounded. But NGOs can lead the way in demonstrating impact and accountability. And I can only speak from my perspective within the Endangered Wildlife Trust, but some of the things that are really important that I've seen us pursue is being proactive around demonstrating transparency. So when required, publishing our audited financial statements, using interactive dashboards to show where money goes and how outcomes are achieved. I think that's a critical component. That's a shift in our mentality within the NGO sector now. Focusing on outcomes and not just activities. So having really critical key performance indicators that really drive outcomes-based metrics, which I think is important. And then it seems fairly obvious, but this is an important component. Adapt strong governance processes and practices. So from the board level to executive leadership to the way that you engage with communities, having structure and policies and procedures in place, whilst painful sometimes, is absolutely critical towards ensuring good governance and provides that transparency that's required. I do think that collectively the NGO sector could do a lot more in terms of building better communication with funders. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. I do think that it is always difficult within the NGO side to invest in your staff, and we certainly try as best as we can to do that. But when you're sitting with conservation scientists, it's also important that they understand financial literacy and project management. So upskilling and training individuals so that they have a better ability to manage this very clear governance framework and create the opportunities to communicate more effectively. And then I think long-term relationships with funders, developing long-term relationships builds trust. And with that trust, I think there's a lot more accountability and transparency. And so certainly within the space, building trust and those partnerships is going to be critical. Thanks, Rendani.
Thank you. On the note of catering to business, there's often, and Danny, this is directed to you. If any of the other panelists want to also add to this question, please feel free to. But conservation funding, especially if driven by business or philanthropy, often prioritizes charismatic or well-known species, sometimes even those that aren't endangered, while broader ecosystem health, especially foundational elements such as soil, biodiversity, receives less attention. Why has the species-centric approach dominated funding decisions? And I'll add to that and say, do you see that trickling down into how your operations at sandparks? And what would it take to shift more support towards conservation biodiversity at the ecosystem level and soil level?
Thanks, Rendani. I think that is such an important question, and one that we as conservationists also feel a little bit uncomfortable about. And I think that this is the reality of where conservation is that because you become so very dependent on external funding, you end up getting your priorities shift to the funders' priorities. You pitch to people issues that are likely to get funded rather than issues that are really priorities. And so in order for us to get better at funding the important things, the priority things, we've got to have a bigger plan. So, I like the statement that Rand Merchants Bank, one of the colleagues there often makes, that we start with species bonds, conservation outcomes bonds, because they're charismatic and you're trying to train a new investor class to invest in conservation. And these are people that don't care about the soil, they don't care about DCAs, they don't care about, all of those issues. But they do feel kind of, quite cool that their money is going towards protecting charismatic species. And so you use that almost as an anchor to get them to start having those conversations and talking about the things that really matter. And so you're building that long-term relationship with investors. And so I think that's, for me, I just feel that that is really what we're not doing enough of. We're stopping at project to project, charismatic to charismatic, and not really thinking about the long sort of system, financial sort of system that you're trying to build, which ultimately creates that. And I saw there was also a question in the chat about communication and awareness raising. And I think that that really is for people to start to have those conversations about the real issues on the ground, because it's complex. It's not easy. The minute you try to solve one problem, you create 10 others. And so you need to actually, so I think sometimes that's also, you don't start to have a conversation with a potential investor telling them that it's so complex and I don't fully know how things quite interact. But you start to sort of have a conversation with them to say, you know what, wild dogs are pretty cool and they're really impacted by snaring. Can't we get a handle on this? And so, and then once we have, and we're starting to make an impact, and you see that, starting to sort of have that impact on communities, and preventing them actually setting snares through sustainable livelihood options, alternatives to wild meat harvesting, etc. You start to sort of build then a little bit of a relationship where we can start to say, okay, now let's start to think about the real thing. Living next to the Kruger Park comes with various disincentives, right? It comes with various costs, and that costs are borne by local communities. And so how can we now sort of create incentives for them to make it worthwhile, or help them achieve what they want to do, not what you want them to do, what you want of them, so that we can actually forge then a better sort of path to go forward. So I think that, yes, charismatic species are important, but we need to move beyond that. But we need to, and so it goes back to that sort of the bigger plan. What are we trying to achieve? We've got to come together. And then each of us in the space has specific skills, right? We've got each NGO, for me, there's been a lot of differentiation of conservation NGOs into core skills and core competencies. And so each of them has a role to play. So absolutely, people that are doing the species monitoring, etc., that's really important. But then the ones that are doing the social development, we want them to come together. But ultimately, we're all working towards a common goal. And I think that for me, that is the big thing. We've got these high-level strategies that we buy into. We sign up to global multilateral environmental agreements. And then we've got our little bits and bobs projects on the ground. It's coming thick and fast, and we have to set out we've got to put in funding applications. But somewhere that middle tier of connecting those dots and having a bigger plan is the missing part of this puzzle, I think.
Thank you, Danny. Just segueing into one of the questions we received from Eventbrite, considering how you make that interlink between communities and conservation, and that it's not just about the charismatic species, it's about the whole system. Somebody asked, how do you think we can make the wildlife economy sector more inclusive and ensure sustainable use at the same time? Danny, that's directed to you.
Yeah, I think this is one that I think we're going to need a lot of partnerships and collaboration. Because we as the conservation, the government and parastatals don't necessarily do SME development, supplier development, business planning, etc. very well. I think that's where we need other partners to come on board and help us to start to sort of create those sort of systems where you can actually have businesses, bioeconomy type of businesses be created. The big issue with it is that initially these are not investable cases. So you almost need a stopgap finance, which allows you to build that business that is then investable. And so we've got to sort of now partner with development finance institutions and grant financing, et cetera, through a blended finance approach to try to make the business case for these individual businesses. Because I believe that's why we're not getting to this equity, because it doesn't really, to create an SMME or a small business, biodiversity-based business, takes a lot of investment, takes a lot of money initially. And it's hard to get that money because initially it doesn't really make business sense. So you need some, especially with the green premium that comes with some of these businesses, you need someone else to take on board that green premium so that you can then build an investable case to a potential investor. So I think that's where partnerships are going to be key. I think, historically, I think I remember reading at some point the history of, sheep farming in the Karoo and how much sheep farming was enabled through government support, subsidies. And, without it, whether it's predator control, logistics networks, roads, fences, etc., without it, it wouldn't have made sheep farming viable. And so this is really and so government played that role historically. Now we need other sort of financial mechanisms to come on board if we're going to build this biodiversity economy that's going to be viable. So I think that's potentially a way. Going to need partnership and collaboration, which I think a lot of others have spoken about before.
On the note of partnership and collaboration, thank you so much, Danny. Kish, Shameela, considering the withdrawal and now this need for these collaborations, in your experience, have you observed more local philanthropists stepping in to fill this gap?
Maybe I'll go first, Shameela, and I'll try and be quick. I think the answer is yes, but it has been, local philanthropy has been cautious and, it's been unevenly undertaken. So it is indeed emerging, but I think in the space between high net worth individuals, local businesses and businesses and corporates who support corporate social investment and foundations tied to family wealth, we are seeing some entities step up, but it's not happening as often as we'd like, specifically in the conservation side of things. I think the shift is not there yet, and it's not systemic. Local funders tend to prefer short-term visible impact projects over longer-term initiatives. And so when we're looking to make impact at scale, 5 to 25 years plus, we're not getting that type of funding. We, as an organization, we don't have many 5+ year funding funders. And so I think that's a critical component. The other aspect is that the focus has largely been, and understandably so in some ways, the focus has largely been on socioeconomic development, education, health, and youth in the Southern African and East African context. And I think there is a shift that we're starting to see, but it's going to take a while before we can start to access good pools of local philanthropy for climate change and biodiversity related activities.
Over to you, Shameela. What's your point of view?
Thanks, Rendani, and I think definitely Kish is better placed to answer that question, given that NGO actively involved in that space. Our interface has been for slightly different projects. We do some that are sitting in the nature space and obviously in climate and just transition in particular. And so we have seen that. So directly to answer the question of are we seeing locals step in a bit more, we definitely have started to see that there's more interest in that work. And seeing that translate into what that means as to what then there's actual bankable appetite for is something I think we need a bit more time to ascertain fully. But it is encouraging that we certainly are seeing that locally, foundations in particular saying they needed to pay a bit more attention. I'm going to give an example, not in conservation, But in Just Transition, for example, the project management unit in the presidency for South Africa's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan has set up a platform, a matching platform now where, you could put projects across, and then you're seeing funders who could then look at that and see if they're interested in funding. Obviously, those would be aligned with the JET investment plan categories, but that is one of the ways in which we're seeing, for example, foundations would be stepping up and looking at that and saying, well, is there something in there that we could look at? And again, with the business hat, yes, because a lot of those are aligned to potential economic opportunities, or at least setting the preconditions for some of the economic opportunities within the context of transition. I do think that the conversation around both what it means from a community and social benefit perspective alongside the environmental is the space that we can do better at framing, and hence being able to look at that. So if you take Kish's point about looking at what already we're seeing some of that funding go to, and it does tend to go towards things like education and healthcare. And those of you familiar with the Trilogue report, where they annually publish what corporates are spending their money on, for example, in relation to CSI, you'll see that prioritization. So his point absolutely holds true in that regard. And so then if that is the interest, but you can align that also with environment, is potentially an area where there's opportunity for us to grow in and make the case a little bit more strongly. And of course, the social priorities are critical. We know that those are critical issues in the country. So if you go behind the scenes and you consider how business sometimes approaches what it spends its money on, particularly in relation to CSI, it's likely going to do a mapping of the issues in the country. And the social ones are going to flag quite high. And so there's a logic and a reason in many instances for why that money goes in that direction. And no one is going to argue that education is not a priority and healthcare is not a priority in a country like ours. So it's finding the sweet spot, I think, between that to make the case stronger, but also to understand that conservation and the outcomes that it is trying to achieve are critically important for health and well-being, right? For being able to do that, for in some instances creating the economic opportunities that are going to help us overcome the inequality barrier. So looking at it in the context of that broader conversation as a country, I think is where there's opportunity, and where certainly with businesses we potentially can find more alignment.
Thank you, Shameela. I think this is quite an intriguing discussion. I don't think 1 hour was enough. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then just give you each 1 minute for your parting shots. What you think should be a priority? What steps you think we should be taking as we leave this webinar? And this speaks more to the priorities that you were talking about, Shameela. You can't protect what you don't measure. That's what most people say. But the thing is, if you don't communicate what you need to protect, nobody's going to pay attention to it. So we have Erica from Rewilding asking, how can we as conservation communicators and researchers ensure that scientific findings are not only published, but translated into accessible action, inspiring narratives? And what role do platforms like their magazine play in bridging the gap between academia and public engagement? I would add to this question and say also in driving more finance coming in your directions as public, private, and all the various sectors that may be impacted.
Rendani, can I just have a quick stab at that? And I saw that question and I thought it's such a critical one, because it's absolutely something grappling with. The other thing that we really need to understand is that we will live in an age of disinformation. And those people that drive the narratives are usually also the ones with the big pockets to be able to drive that narrative, and will shape that and use, all kinds of technology and psychology to be able to push certain agendas. And so the messaging that we're trying to put through has to be one that finds a space where we can prioritize the science, where we can prioritize truth, where we can prioritize fact, and that becomes the things that people consume. But understanding that we're fighting against a tide that is not in our favor in prioritizing those issues or valuing them even in many instances. But within that is the challenge that says, how do we flip that around? So I don't have the answer, but somewhere within that is finding messaging that lands with people and talks to hearts and minds. Because sometimes even as a sector, we are guilty of, we know the science, we know why it needs to be done, and we're going to tell you. Whereas the connection to be able to build a grassroots support for all of that needs to happen. And why does this matter to me? And what does that mean? And when I talk about grassroots, I'm not necessarily talking about a rural community or, for example, where we're seeing human-wildlife conflict or in that context. I'm even talking about just the middle-class person or somebody who would be your average person at a company. Does it really resonate? Do you really care? And where do we create the messaging of why we should care and use those same mechanisms in our favor? And so it's not an answer, but hopefully starting to say that understanding that this is what we're kind of fighting against, but figuring out where we find that fact base that can resonate. And I do think that, businesses have a critical role to play because they have constituencies that they can communicate fact to and be part of that solution. So I see, my sort of constituency absolutely as playing a critical role in that regard, and perhaps even using, the access to resources and skills that it has in relation to communication to support this kind of messaging. And so partnership in that regard is a useful thing.
Thank you, Shameela. Danny?
Yeah, so I thought that's also a very interesting question, and I think I was recently at a meeting of journalists, conservation journalists, and they were talking about how in South Africa we don't have a system where we have paid conservation journalists. So there's only a couple of staff writers on Daily Maverick. And so there is, but if you had to submit a story, you wouldn't get paid for it. And so it may be out there, but you won't get paid for it. So I think that for me then sort of therein lies a bit of a challenge. And we've seen it with polarized sort of narratives in the US versus the UK. The US has very little of a national broadcaster where the government sort of supports national balanced reporting. And in the UK, just by having a state-funded public broadcaster covering those conservation stories or covering those particular stories, you've got a more balanced view. When we looked at stories in Sandparks, we looked at stories around fire, and what we saw was that the minute you had a scientist involved in a story, it tended to be more balanced. Because the reality is that when a journalist is trying to get a quick story out, it's going to be a story, and it's going to be a sub-editor is going to rework that story, and eventually it's going to become a headline that's almost detached from the actual story because it grabs and sells. We end up becoming more and more polarized in terms of the narrative, the messaging that goes out. The reality is that conservation is complex, and that there's two sides, and that it needs to be communicated as such, which means we need to pay people to do good, balanced journalism. And so I think that is really needed in the country. It's lacking. Environmental journalism is another thing, because I do think we're paying for good environmental journalists, investigative journalists to do work. Conservation journalism, there's a critical gap. I think there is also the issue around awareness versus behavioral change. Because I think there's been a lot of global literature now. There's been a great review looking at awareness raising and behavior change. It doesn't actually, equate to the same thing. Because you're aware of something doesn't mean you're going to do the right thing. And so we've got to also be thinking about our means by which we are going to shift the dial in terms of behavior change that's needed. And so that's going to need us to sort of also partner with people like behavioral psychologists that understand how humans think. This is how, commercial entities and business has been doing it for a long time, appealing to people's sort of, the psychology around consumption, etc. And I think we've got to employ some of those techniques if we really want to sort of build awareness that drives behavior change.
Thanks, Danny. In the interest of time, I know we've just scratched the surface. I think there's so much more that could be discussed, but in the interest of time, just give me your 30 seconds of your take-home message, the message that you want all the people on the webinar to leave with once we're done. I'll start with you, Kish.
Fantastic. I think I'll be quick. I think as African NGOs, I'm going to give it through an NGO lens. I think we have to look inward for funding within the African continent. There's rising local wealth, huge opportunities for us to access that wealth. But how do we do that in terms of communication and the right narrative? There's a general civic awakening. So I think people understand local problems require local leadership and ownership. And how do we continue to hammer down on that point and really grow the opportunities in that space? And ultimately, we need to try and create a culture or cultivate a culture of giving within society, within the African and South African society. I think that's really important. And we need to start better showcasing success. So, translating finance into success, how do we showcase those outcomes, really critical in that component. And I think in summarizing, the shift must become a movement that is proudly, South African, proudly African, so that we can start to genuinely create an impact in the conservation space. Thank you, Rendani.
Thanks, Kish. Shameela.
Thank you. I think Kish said a lot there, and I'm happy to support that. But Rendani, there's this saying that I've heard a long time ago that has just stuck in my head, and it goes, and it's really, in my sense, directed a lot of my career and choices. Just been, if you don't invest in the future you want, the one you're going to get is going to be worth infinitely less. And I feel that, this is the kind of work that we're doing, what we're doing requires for us to be so clear about the North Star and the outcomes that we're chasing, because it's a really complex time. It's really difficult, but to constantly ask of ourselves, what is the thing I'm trying to achieve here? And that keeps us from getting sucked into what sometimes just feel like a whirlwind of a world going crazy. And so that is to be so clear about the outcome that we're driving. And hopefully that then translates into all the other things that we know we then need to be prioritizing and hence placing our energy and our resources in.
Thank you, Shameela. Danny.
I think Kish stole my one around showcasing success. So I think that, I think as conservationists, we sometimes crisis communicators. We always want to say that, things are going down, look at the graph, it's all tanking. And I don't think that actually motivates anyone, really. It makes us all feel like we talk in our little echo chamber of people concerned, but I don't think we're able to get other people to buy into our thinking that way. I think we've got to showcase the success. We've got to say, like, we're doing great things in South Africa. I think South Africa's sustainable use model has been successful. We must showcase it because there is so much of, especially in terms of the conservation space, there's a lot of sort of normative views that are dominating the thinking. People, rather than, evidence-based, and I think we must draw on that evidence base. We must draw on those case studies, those good examples of what works on the ground so that we can inform the narrative of how we go forward and build on it. So yes, absolutely, that's the message. And I think I encourage them to get behind our NBSAP, because I believe that can be our roadmap to how we go forward together.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Kish. Thank you, Shameela. What I'm hearing from you all is looking within for solutions, investing in the future that we want, so not being reactive in our approach, and also showcasing our successes and learning from those successes as well, and possibly scaling them to ensure that they're applicable across the areas that they relate to. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us and also for your meaningful contributions to this discussion. It has been more than an hour. We went over time by a bit, but I think it was worthwhile. I'd also like to express my thanks again to Danny, Kish, and Shameela for their valuable input and significant contribution to the conversation. The next OGRC Tipping Points webinar will be scheduled for the 29th of May, where we'll have a discussion about land management and wildlife economies, which is quite fitting in this discussion, just to continue on from this discussion. So please keep an eye out on our social media pages for the registration link. You can sign up to the OGRC quarterly newsletter just to keep up to date on everything that's happening within the organization. And for those of you who may have missed parts of this webinar or wish to revisit it, a recording will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining us and your participation, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next Tipping Point webinar series on the 29th of May. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day, and thank you for sacrificing your lunch for this webinar today. Thank you, everyone.